Bosun, pipe him aboard.
Aye, aye, sir.
Fire, dress ship.
Very good, sir. Dress ship!
A Brief History of Man's Maritime Mastery. Chapter 16. War at Sea. No captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside of an enemy. These words, spoken by Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, embodied the essence of naval warfare as the British fleet patrolled the waters off Cadiz in the fall of 1805. For weeks, they had bottled up Napoleon's fleet in the harbor, waiting for the inevitable clash. Every British sailor knew that soon the French and Spanish ships would emerge to engage in a battle that would determine the fate of empires. The expected battle would be fought in the traditional manner, ships lined up in long battle lines, gun ports open, ready to unleash broadsides in a slugfest of firepower. Though outnumbered, the British crews waited with a confidence born of discipline, skill, and the knowledge that their leader was none other than Lord Nelson. A slight man, with one arm, one eye, and an extraordinary mind, Nelson possessed an instinct for battle, a genius that had become known as the Nelson touch. The fateful day arrived under ominous skies. On the morning of October 21st, 1805, out of the misty dawn, the combined French and Spanish fleets sailed forth. 33 mighty ships of the line, their gilded and brightly painted hulls, gliding under the billowing sails. From the distance they looked like floating palaces, adorned with the splendor of a bygone era. But as the swish of slow-turning water at their bows and the hum of wind in their rigging echoed across the sea, they were met with the grim silhouettes of 27 British warships. Black with yellow gun-port bands, these vessels were no less magnificent, but they carried a more somber purpose. The British fleet resembled sea cathedrals, creations seemingly destined to sail softly toward the glory of God. Yet within moments the serenity was shattered. Blasting trumpets and rolling drums echoed across the decks as the command was given to beat to quarters. Flags flew in a flurry of signals, and the shrill pipes of boatswains signaled the start of battle. Barefoot sailors thundered across the decks and down companionways. Gun ports flew open, flooding the gun decks with light. The planks were painted red to mask the blood that would soon be spilled, and sanded to prevent men from slipping in the heat of combat. Sailors in the role of powder monkey stacked bags of gunpowder, while grim black muzzles were run out. Marines in bright uniforms stepped to their stations as the British fleet closed in on enemy battle lines. But Nelson had a different plan. Instead of angling to meet the enemy ship for ship, he formed his fleet into 2 lines, aiming to break through the enemy's center and destroy their rear before the van could maneuver to their aid. This was the Nelson touch. The French and Spanish closed ranks, their bowsprits nearly prodding through the stern galleries of their own ships. They had the advantage, a raking position that allowed their broadsides to sweep the length of oncoming British ships, while only a few British bow guns could answer. Nelson, undeterred, calmly walked his quarterdeck with his friend and flag captain, Thomas Hardy. Clad in a frock coat with the stars of his 4 orders displayed proudly, Nelson refused to cover his decorations, even though he knew that the enemy sharpshooters would be watching for the small man with an empty right sleeve. Leading one of the attacking lines was Vice Admiral Collingwood. Aboard the Royal Sovereign, her copper-bottom hull clean and her sails full, she surged ahead, her crew spotting the wooden crosses at the end of the Spanish spanker booms. With a glance toward Nelson's flagship, the Victory, they read the signal, "Engage the enemy more closely." Another string of flags rode to the main masthead. England expects that every man will do his duty. As the Royal Sovereign closed in, the first broadside erupted from the enemy lines, smoke wrapping their hulls like a shroud. The Battle of Trafalgar had begun. Nelson watched as Collingwood's ship engaged the massive Spanish vessel Santa Ana, raking her with devastating fire. Yet Nelson remained at ease, pacing leisurely on Victory's deck. Below, gunners stripped to the waist, neckerchiefs wound around their heads to muffle the roar of the guns. Men honed cutlasses, while some incongruously danced a hornpipe to calm their nerves. There were Americans, Germans, even Frenchmen and Spaniards among the British crew, all united in the fury of battle. Shots began to splash around Victory as the enemy's ships found their range. Then, from 4 enemy vessels, a massive broadside erupted, nearly 200 guns unleashing their fury. Splinters flew, rigging snapped, and the sails were torn to shreds. Nelson's secretary, standing near the admiral, was killed instantly. 8 Marines fell in grotesque contortions, and a splinter sheared the silver buckle from Hardy's shoe. Yet Nelson remained unfazed. "This is too warm work, Hardy, to last long," he remarked calmly. But the battle seemed to stretch into eternity. Victory's mizzen topmast came crashing down. Her wheel was smashed, and men rushed below to steal by emergency tackle. She faced a wall of blazing guns, and Hardy asked which ship to head for. Nelson shrugged. "Take your choice." Through a hail of shot, Hardy drove Victory past the stern of the French ship Bucentaure, so close that Victory's main yardarm shattered the French ship's rigging. A thundering broadside of double and triple-shotted guns roared from Victory's guns, smashing into Bucentaure's defenseless stern. The shot howled through the length of the French ship, mowing down men and dismounting cannon. Nelson, as he had planned, had broken the line. One by one, British ships followed Victory through the gap, raking Bucentaure and turning to engage the following enemy vessels. In a maelstrom of flames, smoke, and dying men, the guns roared ceaselessly. Masts crashed onto shattered decks, and the ships drew so close that gunners leaning through the ports to ram home fresh charges had their rammers snatched away by enemy muzzles. With every shot, sailors and gunmen flung buckets of water at the enemy's powder-scorched planking to prevent fires that could consume both ships. As the Victory drew alongside the ship Redoubtable, she hammered her with lower-deck guns. Muskets fired from Redoubtable's fighting tops, but still Nelson strolled the deck with Hardy, seemingly oblivious to the danger. The plan had worked. The enemy's van was now helpless to come to the aid to their beleaguered battle line. Victory was in sight, but the cost would be high. Higher than anyone could have imagined on that fateful day in the fall of 1805. Why didn't those lead ships turn earlier? Perhaps their captains were paralyzed by the fear of Nelson, a fear born of the legend that the strange little admiral had become even before Trafalgar immortalized him. Since the tender age of 12, Nelson sought out the heroic, always pushing beyond the limits of what was expected. By 20, he was already a captain, a mere boy in the eyes of many, including the future King William IV, who'd once described him as such. Wounded during the fight for Corsica in 1793, Nelson lost a sight in one eye. 4 years later, he gave his right arm in a failed attack on Santa Cruz de Tenerife in the Canary Islands. But it was the Battle of the Nile that had finally made him the public hero he had always craved to be. In 1798, the French fleet convoyed troops to Egypt to launch Napoleon's eastern campaign. Nelson found the ships anchored in a seemingly unassailable line at Aboukir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile. The French, confident in their position, hugged the shoal, their ships swinging freely on single anchors. Who ever heard of challenging anchored ships? It was madness. With no sails to handle, every man aboard could focus on the guns. But Nelson, ever the visionary, noticed something. If there was room for French ships to swing, there must be room to sail. As night fell, he struck. Half of his fleet squeezed between the enemy and the shoals, catching the French where they least expected it. The rest kept to deep water, boxing the French in between 2 roaring lines of British fire. The British had hoisted lanterns for recognition, but soon the only light needed came from the blazing French ships. Nelson all but annihilated Napoleon's fleet that night. 3 years later, at Copenhagen, he faced a similar challenge. A line of enemy vessels moored behind shoals and protected by strong forts, seemingly impossible to reach. Undeterred, Nelson gathered shallow-draft ships of the line, sloops, fireships, and bomb vessels, braving the treacherous waters to batter the foe. The carnage was dreadful. When his worried superior signaled to break off the action, Nelson famously put the telescope to his blind eye, declaring, "I have only one eye. I have the right to be blind sometimes." He ignored the order and pressed on to victory. Nelson was worshipped by his crews, beloved by his fellow officers, his band of brothers. Yet his affair with Lady Hamilton shocked the very superiors who would have otherwise honored him without question. Of the 4 orders that adorned him at Trafalgar, only one, the Order of the Bath, had been bestowed by England. But who knows whether it was this insignia that caught the eye of that French sharpshooter that day. As Nelson paced the deck of the Victory, a musket flashed from the mizzen top of the Redoubtable, and the small figure of the Admiral pitched forward. "They have done for me at last, Hardy," he gasped. Finally, Nelson covered his orders with a fresh handkerchief, not wanting his sailors to realize it was he who was being carried below to die. In the crowded cockpit, deep in the bowels of the ship, Nelson lay as the timbers above him trembled with the shock of guns. Cheers echoed through the vessel as one by one the enemy ships, 18 in total, struck their colors. Napoleon's naval power was crippled, and Britannia truly ruled the waves. As the sounds of victory filled the air, Nelson whispered final instructions to his captain, then murmured, "Thank God, I have done my duty." And as the logbook of the Victory records, he then died of his wound, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through the ages.